A white officer's arrogant act of disrespect turns into an unexpected lesson in humility when he learns the man he insulted is his new boss. What happens next will leave you speechless. Welcome to our video. My name is Mark, and I'm so glad you're here today. This story will take you on an emotional journey of transformation, respect, and redemption. Before we begin, let me know in the comments, where are you watching from? I'd love to know. If you enjoy thought-provoking stories that inspire and challenge, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and tap the bell icon so you never miss an update. Now let's dive in. Officer James Richardson had always prided himself on being a man of rules. He was the type of cop who followed procedure to the letter, a stickler for protocol in a city where many had become lax. His reputation among his colleagues was that of someone who could be trusted to keep order, no matter the cost. James didn't mind the tough exterior he'd built over the years. It came with the job. It was another quiet afternoon when James was assigned to his regular patrol shift. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm golden hue over the neighborhood. James was driving around, mindlessly scanning the streets as he had done 1,000 times before. The usual suspects were nowhere to be seen, and the city seemed to be in a rare moment of peace. But something caught his eye as he passed by the precinct. A man stood outside the entrance, leaning against a lamppost. He was dressed well, wearing a sharp black suit that seemed out of place for someone standing on a street corner. The man was gazing up at the precinct building, lost in thought. There was no reason for someone to just stand there, James thought. This wasn't the kind of person who belonged here, at least, not in James's mind. James slowed his patrol car and rolled down the window. "Hey!" he barked from the driver's seat. "What are you doing here?" The man, who James now noticed was black, turned around slowly, his expression calm. "Just waiting for someone," he said, his voice steady. "You don't look like you're here for any good reason," James shot back, sizing him up. He had seen enough over the years to know when something didn't feel right, and this was one of those moments. "I told you I'm waiting," the man replied, not flinching under James's gaze. His calm demeanor only seemed to fuel James's suspicion. "If you're waiting for someone, you should move along," James insisted, his voice growing more impatient. The man raised an eyebrow, clearly taken aback by the officer's tone but remained composed. "I'm not doing anything wrong. Just standing here." James was getting frustrated. He hated being challenged, especially when it came to his authority. He threw open the car door and stepped out, towering over the man. "I said, get moving," he ordered, his voice laced with authority. "You can't just hang around here like that." The man's calmness began to get under James's skin. There was something about him, something that felt too confident, too unfazed by the officer's aggression. Thomas, the man's name was. He had introduced himself simply. But it didn't matter to James. He had no time for pleasantries with people like him. Without any further warning, James spat on the ground beside the man's feet. "Get lost, or things might get worse for you," he growled, not caring how his words landed. He had no patience for people who didn't respect authority. The man's eyes narrowed, but his face didn't change. He didn't flinch or react in anger like James had expected. Instead, he stood still for a moment, letting the tension hang in the air. James could feel his heart beating faster, a rush of adrenaline coursing through him. This was a moment where he needed to assert control, to show who was in charge. But then, something unexpected happened. The man, Thomas, spoke again, his voice quiet but firm. "You might regret this," he said. James took a step back, surprised. What did that mean? Regret this? Who is this guy? Thomas didn't give James a chance to ask any more questions. He turned and walked away, his footsteps calm and deliberate, as if nothing had just transpired. James stood there for a moment, staring after him, confused. There was something strange about that encounter. The man didn't show fear, didn't show anger. He simply walked away. James shook his head, dismissing the interaction. Maybe he had been too harsh, but he didn't care. It was just another day on the job. But deep down, something gnawed at him. The man had said something that stuck in his mind. You might regret this. Who was Thomas really? Why did he seem so unfazed? And what did that warning mean? As James climbed back into his patrol car and drove off, he had no idea that this strange encounter was only the beginning of a life-altering series of events. The man he had just disrespected, the man he had spat on, was about to turn James's world upside down. The precinct was buzzing with excitement as officers filed into the briefing room. It was a routine Monday morning, but there was an air of anticipation that felt different, almost electric. Rumors had been circulating for weeks about a change in leadership, and today was the day they would finally meet their new chief. James Richardson, still haunted by his earlier encounter with Thomas, had been on edge all morning. He tried to push the memory aside, but something about that man, that warning, kept circling in his mind. He had seen thousands of faces in his years on the force, but Thomas had been different. And now, with the announcement of a new chief, James couldn't shake the feeling that the city might be in for some serious changes. The officers filed in, their chatter filled with speculation. Who was this new chief going to be? The department had been without a permanent leader for months after the previous chief had retired. This new hire was supposed to bring fresh perspective and leadership, but no one knew exactly what that meant. James sat at the back of the room, arms crossed, trying to appear nonchalant. He didn't care much for all the buzz. Leadership changes didn't concern him. He had always done his job with or without the higher-ups. But today was different. The room quieted as the door at the front opened, and the commanding officer stepped in. The anticipation was palpable. A tall man in a sharp suit entered with a calm confidence that immediately captured everyone's attention. The buzz died down, and for a brief moment, everyone seemed to hold their breath. "Officers," the man began, his voice commanding yet warm, "thank you for joining me today. I know many of you have been waiting for this moment. My name is Thomas Blackwood, and I'm proud to be your new chief of police." James's eyes widened. It was him. The man he had dismissed earlier, the man he had humiliated. Thomas Blackwood stood before them, the new leader of the precinct, looking every bit the part of a polished, authoritative figure. But it wasn't just the man's stature that shocked James. It was the calmness, the grace with which he carried himself. He seemed to be at ease in the room, as if this moment was just another day for him. James's stomach twisted. The man he had spat on, the man he had dismissed as nothing more than a street corner loiter, was now the very person in charge of his future. The same man who had calmly warned him earlier, "You might regret this," was now standing at the front of the room, poised to lead them all. As Thomas spoke, James found himself struggling to focus. His mind kept drifting back to their earlier encounter. The words, the warning, the way Thomas had spoken to him, there was something about it that made James uneasy. And now here he was, the new chief, and James had no idea how to process this turn of events. Thomas continued, addressing the team with confidence. "I'm not here to reinvent the wheel. But I am here to lead with integrity, fairness, and a commitment to the community. We will work together to restore trust and create a department that serves everyone equally. That is my promise to you." James felt a knot form in his stomach. Restoring trust? After everything that had just happened, how could anyone trust him? How could he trust himself? But Thomas wasn't done. "I know many of you may have questions about my background, about why I was chosen for this role. And I'll answer them, but first, I want to assure you of one thing. I am here because I believe in change. And that starts with me." James's ears perked up. Change? Was Thomas talking about the way things had always been done around here? The traditions James had lived by for years? He had never been a fan of change, and certainly not when it came to his job. Change meant uncertainty. And uncertainty was something James didn't handle well. Thomas's gaze swept across the room. There will be challenges ahead. I'm sure of it. But we will face them together as a team. We will be transparent, we will be accountable, and we will show this city what true leadership looks like. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. James's discomfort grew. This wasn't just about a new boss. This was about a shift in everything he had believed about how things should be done. And it was happening right in front of him. As Thomas finished his speech, he paused and glanced at the officers in the room, making direct eye contact with several of them. But it was James who felt the weight of his stare. It was as if Thomas knew something about him, something that only the two of them shared. "Thank you," Thomas said, his voice still calm but filled with quiet strength. "I'm looking forward to working with each and every one of you." James stood there, frozen in place. The applause that followed seemed distant, muffled by the sound of his racing heart. This can't be happening, he thought. This man, he's the new chief? As the room filled with murmurs of approval, James didn't join in. He couldn't. He was too distracted, too overwhelmed by the realization that his actions had just led to this moment. He had disrespected the very man who now held his career in his hands. And what's worse, Thomas didn't even seem angry. He didn't seem vengeful. Instead, he looked calm, resolute, ready. James felt a sinking feeling in his chest. What had he done? The days following Thomas Blackwood's announcement as the new chief of police were an uneasy mix of tension and anticipation for Officer James Richardson. He had expected to feel relief, to have the weight of the unknown lifted after the leadership change, but instead his anxiety had only deepened. Every glance from his colleagues, every word from Thomas seemed to hold a deeper meaning that James couldn't quite grasp. The precinct was no longer a place of comfort. It was a place where James now felt like an outsider, a place where his actions had come back to haunt him in the worst possible way. It seemed as if the entire department was embracing the new leadership, welcoming the promise of change, except for James. He couldn't shake the thought of that day, the day he had spat on Thomas and sent him away with nothing but a threat. That morning, as James walked into the briefing room, he felt a sense of dread that had followed him for days. Everyone else was chatting casually, but not him. Every conversation around him felt distant, like he was listening from another world. Thomas had been nothing but professional in the meetings since the announcement, addressing the team with authority and grace. But James couldn't forget the warning in Thomas's voice, the calm and deliberate way he had spoken. It was as if Thomas had known something James didn't. Then it happened. James received an unexpected call from the captain's office. "James," the captain's voice crackled through the phone, "I need you in my office." Now, James didn't have to ask why. He knew. Walking down the hall, his footsteps echoed in the empty corridor, and for the first time in a long while, he felt nervous. He had faced confrontations before, busts, robberies, and even the occasional drunk driver, but this was different. This was the man he had wronged, and now, the consequences were about to catch up with him. When he entered the captain's office, Thomas Blackwood was already sitting there, waiting. His posture was calm and collected, his eyes cool as always, but there was something else, something different. The room felt heavy with unspoken words. "Sit down, Officer Richardson," Thomas said, his voice smooth yet firm. "We need to talk." James took a seat across from him, his heart racing. His mind swirled with 100 thoughts, but none of them made sense. He had no idea what to expect, but he was about to find out. "James," Thomas began, his gaze never leaving James's face, "I've been reviewing your record. You're a good officer. Reliable. But something came to my attention that I think we need to address." James swallowed hard. This was it. This was the moment where everything he had worked for, his career, his reputation, was about to unravel. He tried to maintain his composure, but it was difficult under the weight of Thomas's stare. "I don't know if you recall our first meeting, but I remember it quite clearly," Thomas continued, his voice steady. "The way you spoke to me, the way you treated me." He paused, letting the silence hang in the air, the words lingering between them like an uncomfortable weight. James opened his mouth to speak but found no words. How could he apologize? How could he explain his actions when he had no excuse? "I know you're probably wondering why I didn't react the way you expected," Thomas said, leaning forward slightly. I could have reported you right away, had you removed from the force, but I didn't. I wanted to give you a chance to reflect on your behavior. James felt his chest tighten. This was worse than anything he had imagined. Thomas wasn't angry. He wasn't vengeful. He was calm, too calm, and that made everything even worse. Thomas was giving him a chance, but for what? To redeem himself? To prove that he was worthy of respect? I've been in your shoes before, James, Thomas added, his voice low but compassionate. I've been the officer who thought he knew everything, who thought he was always right. I get it. But the moment we start disrespecting each other, especially as officers, it's a slippery slope. And I won't stand for it in my department. The weight of Thomas's words hit James like a ton of bricks. He had always seen himself as a good cop, someone who followed the rules and kept order. But now, in this moment, he realized that his rigid adherence to rules had clouded his judgment. He had hurt someone who was now in a position of power, someone who could destroy his career with a single word. And there was no escaping it. But Thomas didn't leave him with just that. There was a moment of silence before Thomas spoke again. James, this isn't about me. This is about how we treat people, how we handle ourselves, both on and off the job. This is about respect. James felt a pang of guilt in his chest, but he couldn't bring himself to speak. He wasn't sure if he could find the words that would make this right. You'll be receiving a formal reprimand, but I'm not going to fire you. Not yet, Thomas said, his voice gentle but firm. I believe in second chances. But I need to see that you can learn from this mistake, that you can make amends with the people you've wronged. Thomas's words hung in the air, and James felt the crushing weight of them. This wasn't the end of his career. But it could be if he didn't take responsibility, if he didn't learn from this moment. I'm giving you one last chance, James, Thomas added, standing up from his desk. But it's up to you to take it. James left the office with a heavy heart, the reality of his actions setting in. The man he had disrespected was now giving him a second chance. But would he take it? Would he learn from this experience? Or would his pride continue to hold him back? As James stepped out into the hallway, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about a mistake he had made with Thomas. This was about something deeper, something personal. And it wasn't just his job that was on the line anymore. It was his integrity. Days passed, and Officer James Richardson couldn't shake the burden that now rested heavily on his shoulders. Despite Thomas Blackwood's second chance, James had found it impossible to move past the mistake he had made. Every glance from his colleagues felt like judgment. Every whispered conversation felt like a reminder of the disgrace he had brought upon himself. The precinct, once a place of pride, now felt like a cage. But it wasn't just the weight of his mistake that troubled him. It was the fact that the more he thought about it, the more he realized how deeply he had underestimated Thomas. The new police chief wasn't just a man in a position of power, he was someone who had shown empathy, patience, and professionalism. He had seen the potential for change in James, even when James had seen nothing but the consequences of his own actions. The more James reflected on his behavior, the more he realized that Thomas had been right all along. It wasn't just about being a good cop, it was about being a good person, about being someone who could inspire respect, not demand it. The power of respect was something James had always taken for granted, something he had never truly understood until now. That's when everything started to shift for him. He could no longer hide behind his pride, his ego, or his fear. He had to confront his mistakes and, more importantly, he had to make things right. One morning, as James walked into the precinct, he made a decision that would change everything. He walked straight to Thomas's office and knocked gently on the door. "Come in," Thomas called from inside. James opened the door, his heart pounding in his chest. Thomas was sitting at his desk, reviewing some files, but he looked up when he heard the door open. There was no sign of anger or resentment in his eyes, just the calm, collected expression James had come to recognize. "Chief Blackwood," James said, his voice steady but uncertain. "I need to talk to you." Thomas didn't say anything right away. Instead, he gestured to the chair across from him. "Go ahead, James." I'm listening. James took a deep breath before speaking, his words coming slower than he had expected. I owe you an apology. Not just for what I did that day, but for the way I've treated you since then. I was wrong. I let my pride get the better of me, and I've been carrying that weight ever since. Thomas's eyes softened, but he didn't interrupt. Instead, he waited for James to continue. I thought I could just brush it off, but I can't. I can't go back to being the officer I was before, not after everything that's happened, James continued. I've learned that being a good cop isn't just about doing the job, it's about treating people with respect, no matter who they are or what position they hold. And I failed you. I failed myself. The words felt heavy in his mouth, but they were the truth. For the first time in a long while, James felt like he was being honest with himself. The mistakes he had made, both in his personal life and in his professional career, had come to a head, and he couldn't pretend anymore. Thomas sat back in his chair, his expression thoughtful as he considered James's words. After what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke. I appreciate your honesty, James, Thomas said, his voice calm but firm. Apologies are important, but actions speak louder than words. I believe in second chances, but I also believe in accountability. I need to see that you're truly ready to make this right, not just for me, but for the people you work with. James nodded. I understand. I'm ready to prove it. I'll do whatever it takes. A small smile tugged at the corner of Thomas's lips. That's all I ask. I want to see you grow, James. But growth doesn't happen overnight. It takes time, effort, and a willingness to learn from your mistakes. Are you prepared for that? I am, James said, his voice unwavering now. I want to be the officer you thought I could be. I want to earn back the trust I've lost. There was a long pause, and then Thomas stood up from his desk and extended his hand. Then let's get to work. James stood up as well, shaking Thomas's hand firmly. For the first time in weeks, he felt like a weight had been lifted from his chest. It wasn't over yet, but it was the first step toward redemption. But just as he turned to leave the office, Thomas called out to him. James, he said, his voice serious. There's one more thing. James stopped in his tracks and turned back toward Thomas. What is it, Chief? Thomas's expression shifted slightly, becoming more intense. The city is going through a lot right now. There's corruption in the ranks. We've had a few officers making some questionable decisions, and I need someone I can trust to help root it out. Are you in? The question hung in the air, and James's mind raced. This was the opportunity he had been waiting for, a chance to prove himself, to truly make a difference. But it wasn't going to be easy. It was going to be dangerous, messy, and perhaps even risky. James looked at Thomas, feeling a surge of determination. I'm in, he said without hesitation. I'm ready. Thomas nodded approvingly, and with that, James knew his journey was far from over. The challenge ahead would test everything he had learned. His integrity, his strength, and his ability to put others before himself. As he left the office, his mind was filled with the weight of what was to come. There was no turning back now. James had made his decision, and it would change the course of his life forever. The days that followed were a whirlwind of action. James, once again, found himself in the thick of the investigation, working alongside Chief Thomas Blackwood to uncover the corruption that had been festering within their ranks. But this time, it was different. James wasn't just going through the motions, he was doing it with a newfound sense of purpose. Each lead, every piece of information, felt like a step toward redemption. A way to right the wrongs he had committed and prove himself not just to his fellow officers, but to himself. As they dug deeper, the true scale of the corruption began to surface. What they had initially thought was a few isolated incidents turned out to be a web of deceit, stretching far beyond what James had ever imagined. Officers, city officials, and even business leaders were involved. This wasn't just a few bad apples, it was a system that needed to be dismantled. James and Thomas spent long hours at the precinct, reviewing evidence, analyzing phone records, and tracking the movements of suspects. The deeper they went, the more dangerous things became. Threats started to appear, first in the form of anonymous notes, then later as suspicious vehicles tailing them after hours. It was clear someone didn't want them getting too close. One night, as James and Thomas were reviewing a series of confidential reports in the back office, a sharp knock on the door interrupted their concentration. James's hand instinctively went to the gun at his side, but Thomas raised a hand, signaling him to stay calm. "Come in," Thomas called. The door creaked open, and Officer Danielle Harris, a trusted colleague, stepped into the room. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with concern. "Chief, Officer Richardson," she began, her voice shaky. "I think we've been compromised. I received a call. Someone's tipped off the corrupt officers. They know we're investigating them." James's stomach dropped. He had known this day might come, but the reality of it hit him like a freight train. This wasn't just a matter of uncovering corruption anymore. It was a fight for survival. "What are we going to do?" Danielle asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas leaned back in his chair, his expression stoic. "We need to move fast. We can't afford to waste time." But just as he finished speaking, the phone on Thomas's desk rang. Everyone froze, the tension thick in the air. Thomas answered it, his voice calm but guarded. "This is Chief Blackwood," he said into the receiver. James watched him closely, trying to gauge the situation. Thomas's face remained unreadable, but as he listened, James noticed the subtle tightening of his jaw, the slight furrow of his brow. Whoever was on the other end of the line was giving him something serious to consider. After a long pause, Thomas finally spoke. "Understood," he said, hanging up the phone. "That was internal affairs. They have intel on one of the officers involved in the corruption ring. They need us to move in now, before things escalate." James felt his heart race. This was the moment of truth. It was time to take action. "Let's go," James said, determination flooding his veins. The operation was set for the next day, and everything was in motion. James, Thomas, and their trusted colleagues gathered in the briefing room early in the morning, going over the plan one last time. James's nerves were on edge. This was it, the culmination of everything he had worked for, everything he had fought to redeem himself for. He couldn't afford to fail. But just as the briefing was about to wrap up, Thomas pulled James aside. "James," Thomas said in a low voice, "there's something you need to know. You've come a long way, and I believe in you. But tomorrow might not go the way we think. Things are going to get messy." James met his eyes. "I understand. I'm ready." "Good," Thomas said with a grim nod. "But remember, this isn't just about exposing corruption. It's about getting everyone out safely. You've got a lot riding on this, but don't lose sight of what's important." As James walked out of the briefing room, the weight of Thomas's words lingered in his mind. This wasn't just about him anymore. It wasn't about clearing his name or proving something to anyone. It was about justice. About the people they swore to protect. The next day, they moved quickly. James, Thomas, and their team stormed the building where the corrupt officers were believed to be operating. The adrenaline was overwhelming, and the tension was palpable. James's heart pounded in his chest as he moved silently through the hallways, his eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. Then, just as they were about to breach a door that led to the heart of the operation, something unexpected happened. A shot rang out, narrowly missing James. His instincts kicked in, and he ducked behind cover, his weapon drawn. "Stay low," Thomas shouted, his voice urgent. "We're not alone." The firefight that ensued was chaotic, a blur of movement and flashing lights. James could hear his heart thudding in his ears, the sound of bullets ricocheting off walls, the sharp commands of his fellow officers as they returned fire. The noise was deafening, and every second felt like an eternity. But just as the situation seemed to reach its breaking point, James saw something that made his blood run cold. A familiar face appeared in the doorway, a face he had never expected to see again. It was Officer Daniel Thomas, a fellow cop from his earlier days. He was supposed to be a trusted ally, but now, James could see the betrayal in his eyes. Daniel was one of the officers involved in the corruption. In that moment, everything clicked. This wasn't just about cleaning up the precinct, it was about exposing the deep-rooted conspiracy that had been hiding in plain sight. Daniel had been playing both sides, and he wasn't going to go down without a fight. With his back against the wall, James made a split-second decision. The firefight was still raging, but he knew what had to be done. He couldn't let Daniel escape. With adrenaline coursing through him, James sprinted toward the door, ready to confront the one person who had betrayed everything they stood for. As he reached the door, Daniel turned to face him, a cruel smirk on his face. "Did you really think you could stop this?" he sneered. "You're just a pawn in a bigger game." James's grip tightened on his gun, his heart racing. This was the final test. Would he let the corruption win, or would he take a stand once and for all?